It was a random night, one of those nights when everything seems to be running its normal course. I had just left the office, my mind already clear of the worries of the day. The streets were busy, but something in the air seemed different. Perhaps it was just the inner silence that accompanies moments before a great revelation. I didn't know that, in just a few hours, my life would take an unexpected turn. At first, it was a message from an unknown number. A simple alert: your wife is having dinner with another man right now. La Cime Restaurant. Check it out if you doubt it. I laughed nervously, believing it to be a mistake, a cruel joke. But, as the night progressed, that message grew like a shadow, taking over me. My intuition began to shout louder than my reason. I grabbed my car keys and decided to check for myself, hoping deep down that it was all just a big misunderstanding. I arrived at the restaurant. The atmosphere was luxurious, with its imposing facade and lights that reflected an almost unreal opulence. I walked in, ignoring the waiter who was trying to usher me in politely. The room was packed, full of smiles and hushed conversations. And there they were, at the central table, visible to everyone. She was laughing at something he said, a laugh I would recognize anywhere, but which at that moment sounded like a direct blow to my stomach. The man in front of her confidently leaned over the table, casually touching her hand. My heart raced. The beats deafened any noise around me. I wanted to believe it was just a business meeting or a coincidence. But when she leaned in slightly and he put his hand on hers, as if they were accomplices in something secret, all the doubts I had evaporated. Suddenly, everything seemed like a blur. I walked towards them with firm steps, ignoring the surrounding tables, which gradually fell silent, feeling the tension in the air. As I approached, I noticed the expression on her face change, from carefree laughter to paralyzing shock. He turned around, surprised but not embarrassed. It was she who broke the silence. It's not what you think. The cliched phrase sounded like an empty echo, almost an involuntary confession. I didn't answer straight away. My voice seemed lost somewhere between anger and despair. Instead, I sat in the empty chair next to them, staring at them, waiting for an explanation. When the words finally came, they came out cold, controlled. So explain to me what I should think. She stammered. He tried to intervene. We don't need to make a scene out of this. I looked at him, and my anger overflowed for the first time. Do you think this is a scene? Wait until I decide what to do with you two. There was no need to shout. My tone was low, almost a whisper, but it carried such dense fury that the man immediately backed off. She started mumbling something about regret, about how confused she was, but none of it mattered. There, on that table, something inside me died. I got up without hearing the rest of her explanation. Before I left, I said just one sentence: you both deserve exactly what's coming. I knew that moment would be the end of something great, but I could hardly imagine what fate still had in store for the three of us. The restaurant was behind us, but the images of them together continued to burn in my mind like embers. That betrayal was only the beginning. What came after, the consequences, the secrets revealed, the inevitable confrontations, turned that dark chapter of my life into something I never imagined I would experience. And now, looking back, I ask myself, was it love that took me there? Or something darker, something that feeds on pain, loss and betrayal? One thing is certain, no one comes out unscathed when their heart is broken in this way. Welcome to the channel where stories of love, betrayal and their devastating consequences come to life. Here, we don't support or romanticize betrayal. The stories are fictional, but they carry a powerful message. Betrayal is capable of destroying lives and relationships in unimaginable ways. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and turns, and discover how today's choices can echo forever. Good story, and be ready to be shocked. The evening breeze came through the windows of the spacious apartment in the city center, carrying the soft scent of early spring. Ethan was sitting on the sofa, looking at the papers that had accumulated on the small glass table. A dedicated lawyer, his routine was often absorbed by tight deadlines and demanding clients, but that night, his mind was elsewhere. He glanced at the kitchen door, where Sophie, his wife, was singing softly as she prepared something light for them both. It was a sound he associated with comfort, although at that particular moment it couldn't dispel a restlessness that insisted on hanging around him. Sophie was the kind of woman whose presence brightened up any room. With a natural charm and an easy laugh, she knew how to make the people around her feel seen and heard. A visual artist by profession, Sophie had a talent for transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary, and their home was proof of this. Every detail in the room seemed to breathe a welcoming essence, meticulously created by her. The studio in the corner of the apartment, with scattered brushes and unfinished canvases, was a constant reminder of her passion. Ethan and Sophie had been married for 8 years. They had met at an art exhibition, a meeting that seemed straight out of a romantic movie, the crossed eyes, the flowing conversation, the feeling that they were in the right place at the right time. Since then, they had shared a life that, although routine in many respects, carried moments of intense connection. There was comfort in the way Sophie knew Ethan's subtlest gestures and how he understood her insecurities before she even needed to express them. But like any relationship, theirs was not without its challenges. Ethan was methodical and somewhat pragmatic, qualities that made him excellent in his profession, but which sometimes clashed with Sophie's free and impulsive spirit. Small arguments about trivial things, such as vacation planning or how often they had friends over, were common, but always ended in reconciliation. Until then, they had believed that these disagreements were part of the package of a solid marriage. That evening, as Sophie brought 2 plates to the table and sat down facing him, Ethan noticed something different in her eyes. It was a glint that he wasn't sure how to interpret. She seemed to be thinking about something, perhaps a new idea for her art or some plan she hadn't yet shared. He smiled, trying to push away the distracting thoughts. "You seem distant today," said Sophie, leaning forward slightly. "Long day at the office." "It's business as usual," Ethan replied, looking away. She nodded, but didn't press the issue. Sophie knew when Ethan needed space, something she had learned over the years. But inside, she also carried a restlessness. Lately, she had felt disconnected from something she couldn't name. It was as if the layers of her life, perfectly organized and predictable, were no longer enough to fill her. It wasn't Ethan's fault, or even hers. It was an emptiness that simply existed, without clear explanations. As the days passed, the couple's routines remained unchanged. Ethan remained immersed in his work, while Sophie divided her time between exhibitions and projects in her studio. Weekends usually involved meeting friends in nearby cafes or walking in parks, habits they both enjoyed. However, there were times when the silence between them seemed more charged than usual, as if something unspoken hung in the air. That Friday, Ethan arrived home later than usual. Sophie was in the living room, with a glass of wine in her hand and a distracted smile on her face. She was wearing a blue silk robe that Ethan had always found beautiful. He approached her and kissed her forehead. "Are you expecting someone?" he joked, noticing the extra effort in her appearance. Sophie laughed, but didn't reply immediately. "No. I just felt like getting ready today," she said, shrugging. There was something in her voice that caught Ethan's attention. It wasn't a lie, but it didn't sound like the whole truth either. He turned away, trying not to read too much into it. He was tired and didn't want to start an argument based on a vague intuition. Later that night, while Sophie slept soundly beside him, Ethan stared at the ceiling, feeling a heaviness he couldn't identify. His mind revisited small recent interactions, trying to find a pattern that justified what he felt. Her laughter seemed louder lately, but her responses to it shorter. Small details, perhaps insignificant, but now gaining larger proportions in his head. On the other hand, Sophie wasn't without internal conflicts either. That same day, she had received an unexpected message from an old friend. It was someone she had lost touch with years ago, but whose reacquaintance had been greeted with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She knew she shouldn't fuel the conversation, but she did. There was something tantalizing about the familiarity of that person, a sense of freedom that made her question parts of herself that had seemed dormant for a long time. While Ethan planned his next steps at work and Sophie immersed herself in her artistic world, the two of them were like two boats on the same river, but sailing in opposite directions. Neither of them was fully aware of the chasm that was beginning to form between them, but they could both feel it. The house they shared, full of happy memories, now seemed bigger, almost empty at times. And although they still loved each other in ways that were undeniable, the silence between them grew, subtle and persistent, like a reminder that something was about to change. Ethan had gotten used to being the last to leave the house in the morning, seeing Sophie already immersed in her paintings or finishing her hair in front of the bedroom mirror. She always said that she preferred to start the day at her own pace, without the rush of the outside world. He admired that about her, even when her own routine didn't allow for such luxury. Lately, however, something about her mornings seemed different. Sophie's smile, always so natural, seemed more restrained, almost mechanical. Small changes that he didn't know how to address without seeming paranoid. That Wednesday, Sophie was especially silent while they had coffee. Ethan tried to strike up a casual conversation about the plans for the weekend. Maybe we could do something different on Saturday. How about a walk? He suggested, trying to break the ice. That's fine, but I think I'm going to the studio on Saturday. I still need to finish that piece for the gallery, she replied, without looking him in the eye. Ethan nodded, trying to disguise his disappointment. He knew Sophie's projects were important, but the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers was unavoidable. Sophie, on the other hand, avoided looking at him because she knew that any longer exchange of glances could expose what she had been carrying around for the last few days, a growing guilt that was beginning to suffocate her. Ever since the unexpected message from her old friend had arrived, Sophie had felt like she was on a tightrope. At first, they were casual conversations, quick messages, nothing that seemed to cross the line. But as the days went by, the tones changed. The words became more intimate, and the reunion she'd thought about postponing ended up being scheduled. It was something she justified to herself as innocent, but Sophie knew it was dangerous ground. Ethan, meanwhile, was struggling to balance the pressures at work and the growing worries at home. He was an observant man, and the changes in Sophie's behavior did not go unnoticed. Her glances became more distant, her excuses to spend more time outside the apartment more frequent. He even mentioned it casually to a colleague at the office, but the response didn't help much. Marriages have ups and downs. Sometimes it's just a phase, said his friend. Ethan wanted to believe that. He tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that Sophie was just distracted by her projects. But there were nights when he lay awake, watching her sleep, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on. On Friday night, while Sophie was in the shower, her phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. Ethan, who was preparing a coffee, noticed the notification on the screen, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." His heart raced. For a moment, he stood frozen, trying to decide what to do. He knew that invading her privacy would be a step that might have no return, but curiosity and anguish spoke louder. He unlocked his phone and opened the message. The sender was just a name he didn't recognize. There was a history of recent exchanges, short messages, seemingly innocent at first glance, but which, for Ethan, carried devastating implications. When Sophie came out of the bathroom, Ethan was back on the sofa, trying to look distracted by a book. But his insides were on fire. He didn't confront Sophie that night. Instead, he decided to wait, to observe, to try to understand how far it would go. The next morning, Sophie left early. She said she would spend the day in the studio. Ethan, still struggling to process everything, decided to follow her. It wasn't something he was proud of, but doubt was eating away at him. He saw her take a cab and followed in his own car, keeping his distance. The cab stopped in front of a restaurant he recognized immediately, a sophisticated place they used to go to together for birthdays or special occasions. She went inside, and Ethan parked across the street, trying to stay calm. A few minutes later, he saw a man walk in and head towards the table where Sophie was sitting. The man smiled, leaning over to greet her familiarly. Ethan felt as if the ground beneath his feet was disappearing. They chatted animatedly, and Sophie smiled in a way he hadn't seen for months. Ethan didn't know whether to be more annoyed by the scene or at himself for still hesitating to go in and confront them. For a few more minutes, he remained in the car, watching the scene that felt like a slow, painful blow to everything he believed about his marriage. Finally, he took a deep breath and got out of the car. His hands were sweating and his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He crossed the street, entered the restaurant and walked towards the table. When Sophie saw him, her expression instantly changed from joy to pure shock. The man in front of her turned around slowly, confused by the sudden interruption. Ethan stopped, crossing his arms, staring at Sophie with a look that needed no words to understand. She opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came out. The silence in the restaurant was almost deafening. The people at the surrounding tables began to realize what was happening. Ethan finally broke the silence. "I hope I'm wrong, Sophie. But if I'm not, you owe me an explanation. Now." Sophie started to speak, but her voice was shaking. The words came out disjointed, unable to form a solid defense. The man, visibly uncomfortable, stood up, mumbling something about not wanting to cause trouble. But Ethan kept his eyes on Sophie, waiting. There, in the center of a restaurant full of strangers, the truth he had feared was revealed in a single glance. No more words were needed. What Ethan had seen over the last few days, the messages, her behavior, it all made sense now. He walked away without saying another word, leaving Sophie standing there, motionless, as the weight of the betrayal finally fell on them both. But deep inside Ethan, a new question began to emerge: what now? What will be the next blow that life is about to deliver? Ethan was sitting in the waiting room of his lawyer's office, staring at the clock on the wall. The ticking seemed amplified, each second dragging slower than the last. Since the confrontation in the restaurant, he hadn't seen or spoken to Sophie. She tried calling, texting, even showing up at his apartment door, but he hadn't picked up. Ethan needed time to process everything. Now, holding a folder full of documents and evidence, he felt that control of his life, once so stable, was slipping through his fingers. He wasn't a man who dealt well with chaos, but chaos seemed to have decided to settle into his life for good. When the lawyer called him, Ethan stood up and entered the room, where a large dark wooden table dominated the atmosphere. "Shall we begin?" asked the lawyer, gesturing for him to sit down. Ethan nodded, but before the lawyer could continue, his phone vibrated. He ignored it at first, but the insistence caught his attention. Reluctantly, he checked the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. Curiosity overcame him and he opened the text. "You don't know everything. We need to talk. It's important." For a moment, Ethan considered ignoring it. Who else could be involved in this? However, something in the tone of the message made him hesitate. He excused himself from the lawyer and left the room, dialing the number. A male voice answered, firm, but laden with a perceptible tension. "Ethan, well, let's just say I'm someone who understands what you're going through. Can we meet? There's something you need to know about Sophie." "Who are you? And why should I trust you?" snapped Ethan, anger still simmering under the surface. "This isn't about trust, it's about you knowing the full truth. I can only explain in person." Despite his distrust, Ethan agreed. He made an appointment at a discreet cafe on the other side of town, feeling he had little to lose. When he arrived, he found a well-dressed middle-aged man sitting at a table at the back. The man seemed restless, fiddling with the ring on his finger as if it were some kind of shield. Ethan sat down, crossing his arms and waiting for the stranger to speak first. He wasn't willing to waste unnecessary words. My name is Julian, the man began. I was Sophie's best friend's husband before all this. Ethan frowned, confused. Julian seemed hesitant, but finally continued, I know you're dealing with her betrayal, but what you might not know is that Sophie and, he paused, almost as if the next word would be difficult to pronounce, her lover, have a longer history than you realize. That wasn't the first time. Ethan felt the air disappear from his lungs. He stared at Julian, trying to process what he had just heard. How do you know that? He asked, almost in a whisper. Because I've been in your shoes. Years ago, Sophie and he started something, while I was still married. I didn't know right away, but when I found out, everything fell apart. He was close to our family, and I never suspected. Sophie cut him off, or so she told me. But now, seeing what's happening to you, I realize that she never really shut it down. Julian's words were like daggers. Ethan wanted to believe that he was lying, but the man seemed sincere, almost relieved to finally share the truth. Why tell me this now? Ethan asked, his voice heavy with frustration. Because no one told me when I needed to hear it. I watched my life fall apart without explanation, while they carried on as if nothing had happened. I knew Sophie was repeating the same pattern, and I thought you should know before it was too late. Ethan was silent for a long time. Julian's words mingled with the memories he had been reliving over the last few days, Sophie's smiles, the moments when she seemed distant, the frequent apologies. It was all starting to make sense in a way he didn't want to believe. Finally, he stood up, thanking Julian with a short nod. He wasn't sure what he would do with this information, but he needed some air. As he walked through the busy streets, his mind revolved around what to do next. He could confront Sophie with what he had just discovered or simply move on, cutting all ties at once. But something inside him pushed him to seek answers. He went back to his apartment and, for the first time since the incident at the restaurant, replied to one of Sophie's messages. We can talk. At home. Now. In less than half an hour, Sophie arrived. Her eyes were red, indicating that she had been crying, but her expression was one of determination. Ethan was standing in the living room, waiting for her to start. I know you hate me now. But please, let me explain, Sophie began, her voice shaking. Explain what, Sophie? That this wasn't a one-off mistake. That you've been involved with him for years. Ethan retorted, his voice firm but full of emotion. Sophie froze, the color draining from her face. She opened her mouth, but couldn't answer immediately. Ethan seized the moment. Julian told me everything. He told me how you destroyed his marriage before you started destroying ours. How many other people have to suffer because of you too? Tears began to roll down Sophie's face. She tried to hold back the sobs, but they escaped anyway. I didn't know he'd spoken to you, she finally admitted. Yes, it's true. I've known him a lot longer than you think. We had something in the past, but I thought it was over. I thought I could move on with you, Ethan. I swear I tried. Ethan felt anger and disgust take over. You tried? Is that all our marriage meant to you? An attempt? Sophie tried to approach him, but Ethan took a step back. He couldn't bear the thought of being so close to her at that moment. Why weren't you honest? Why didn't you tell me? He asked, almost begging for an answer that would justify everything. Sophie hesitated before answering, because I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of admitting to myself that maybe I'd never gotten over what I felt for him. But that doesn't mean I don't love you, Ethan. He laughed, a bitter sound that filled the silence of the room. Love? Sophie, what you did has nothing to do with love. And now, everything we've built, all the years we've shared, mean nothing. Sophie fell to her knees, defeated. I know I can't fix it, but I still had to tell you the truth. Ethan watched her, his heart torn between grief and the need to move on. He knew that the revelation he had just heard was only part of what he needed to resolve, but one thing was clear: his life would never be the same again. The silence in the apartment seemed to have a weight of its own, filling the spaces between the furniture and stifling any attempt at reasoning. Ethan was standing by the window, watching the city that continued its constant movement, indifferent to the chaos that was unfolding inside his mind. Sophie was still sitting on the floor, her hands covering her face as tears slipped between her fingers. Despite all the anger and disappointment consuming Ethan, he couldn't ignore the genuine pain she was showing. But was that enough to soften the impact of what he had discovered? He had no answers. After a long time, he broke the silence, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't know how we can come back from this, Sophie. In fact, I don't think we can." She raised her face, her eyes swollen and red. The desperation in her expression was palpable. "Ethan, I know I've ruined everything. I know you have every reason to hate me, but I don't want to lose you." He turned to face her, his gaze full of weariness and sadness. "Lose? Sophie, you've already lost. When you made those decisions, when you chose to hide, to lie, you lost me there. And, frankly, I don't even know who you are anymore." Sophie tried to speak, but her voice failed her. She knew Ethan was right, but that didn't make the moment any less devastating. Inside, she was struggling with a maelstrom of regret and guilt, mixed with the growing realization that her actions had irreversible consequences. Ethan walked over to the table and picked up the envelope he had received from his lawyer earlier. He placed the envelope in front of Sophie, who looked at it as if it were something radioactive. "Divorce," he said, with frightening calm. "I don't want any more arguments, I don't want any more lies. I just want it settled." Sophie grabbed the envelope with trembling hands, but didn't open it. Her tears fell onto the paper, forming little spots that slowly spread. "Ethan," she began, but he interrupted her. "There's nothing more to say. I'm going to spend some time away until this is resolved. You can stay here until we find a solution to everything. But, Sophie, don't look for me. Don't call me. I don't want to hear any more excuses." Without giving her time to reply, Ethan picked up his previously prepared backpack and left the apartment. He didn't look back, even when he heard the muffled sound of Sophie's sobs as the door closed. Over the next few days, Ethan rented a small apartment in a more secluded neighborhood, a space he chose specifically because it was simple and far from any memory of his old life. He needed time to reconnect with himself, to process not only the betrayal, but also the revelations Julian had brought. He felt betrayed in a way that went beyond marriage. It was as if the very notion of trust had been ripped from his life. Ethan immersed himself in his work, using his clients' cases as a necessary distraction. But at night, when the silence returned, he found himself revisiting every detail of his relationship with Sophie, trying to understand where it all started to go wrong. There were moments when he wondered if he could have done something differently, if he could have been more attentive, more present. But then the anger returned, reminding him that the responsibility for Sophie's choices was hers, and hers alone. Meanwhile, Sophie remained in the apartment. She didn't have the strength to face the world, let alone the friends or family who would inevitably ask questions. Her routine became almost non-existent, the days blending into a haze of regret and self-pity. She opened the divorce envelope several times, but never managed to sign the papers. Each time she tried, it was like admitting to herself that it was really over. One afternoon, Sophie received an unexpected visit. Julian was at her door, his countenance filled with a somber seriousness. "Can we talk?" he asked. She hesitated, but eventually allowed him in. Julian sat on the sofa, looking around the apartment that had once been so lively and welcoming. He seemed to search for something in Sophie's eyes, as if he wanted to understand whether she really understood the depth of what she had caused. "I spoke to Ethan," Julian began. "He needed to know the truth." Sophie nodded, unsurprised. She knew that Julian had become a kind of guardian of that inconvenient truth. "I deserved it," she said at last. "I just didn't think I'd lose everything at once." Julian crossed his arms, leaning forward. "Sophie, what you did was more than a mistake. It was a choice. A choice that hurt not just Ethan, but many people along the way. You can't go on living as if everything can be fixed with words." She looked at him, surprised by the harshness in his tone. Julian had always been direct, but there was something else in his voice now, a weariness, perhaps even a certain resentment. "Why are you here?" she asked, with a mixture of curiosity and bitterness. "Because, as much as I've suffered because of you, I can't ignore the fact that you're destroyed too. And, deep down, I wanted to understand if there was anything in you that was still worth saving." Sophie didn't answer. She lowered her head, feeling the weight of her actions like never before. Julian stood up, walking to the door. "Think about it, Sophie. Not for me, not for Ethan. For yourself." And with that, he left, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Ethan, on the other hand, began to reevaluate his life more broadly. He realized that, as much as Sophie's betrayal had devastated him, there was something liberating about finally breaking up. For the first time in years, he began to consider the possibility of moving on, of making room for something new. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but he felt he was on the right track. One day, while reviewing documents at a local coffee shop, Ethan noticed a woman sitting a few tables away. She seemed to be concentrating on a book, but there was something about her quiet posture that caught his attention. Without realizing it, he began to observe her between breaks in her reading. When she looked up and the two of them stared at each other for a brief moment, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced for a long time, curiosity. Although hesitant, he decided to approach her. The conversation began with something banal, a comment about the book she was reading. But as they talked, Ethan felt an unexpected comfort. She was intelligent, perceptive but, above all, genuine. There was a lightness in her company that contrasted with the weight he had been carrying for the last few months. As he said goodbye, Ethan found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. He still didn't know where this interaction would lead, but, for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't tied to the past. The story was still not completely resolved, but something inside Ethan had changed. He realized that, even in the shadows of betrayal, there was room for hope. And as he gazed at the horizon that afternoon, he knew he was ready to find out what came next. The apartment that had once been Ethan and Sophie's home now seemed like a space of fragmented memories. The light coming through the windows no longer illuminated moments of joy, but shadows of a past that neither of them could completely erase. Sophie was sitting at the living room table, the divorce papers in front of her. After days of putting it off, she knew she had to make a decision. The ink of the pen seemed to weigh a ton as she signed each page, officially closing a chapter in her life that, deep down, she wished she could rewrite. Ethan, on the other hand, was in his new routine, working hard to rebuild his life. Although he still felt the echoes of the pain Sophie had caused, he began to realize that the weight he was carrying was lessening. His unexpected friendship with the woman he had met in the coffee shop, called Clara, had turned into something he hadn't planned, but which filled the void in a gentle and unexpected way. Clara was different from Sophie. Her presence brought tranquility instead of turbulence, and Ethan began to believe again in the possibility of finding happiness. That afternoon, while Ethan was organizing his files in his office, he received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Ethan?" The voice on the other end was familiar, but hesitant. "Sophie?" He answered, surprised. "I know I shouldn't be calling, but I need to say something. Please listen to me." Ethan took a deep breath. The last thing he wanted was to open wounds that were still healing, but something in Sophie's voice stopped him from hanging up. "Say what you need to say," she replied, with controlled calm. "I just wanted you to know that I signed the papers." It's all settled. But that's not all. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she continued. I want to apologize, Ethan. Not for me, not to assuage my guilt, but because you deserve to hear it. You were all I ever needed, but I was blind to realize it. And now it's too late. Ethan remained silent for a moment. He didn't feel anger, but he also didn't feel the forgiveness that Sophie might have hoped for. Thank you for saying that, Sophie. But you're right, it's too late. I hope you can find something good in all this and learn from your mistakes. For me, moving on is the only thing left. Sophie hung up, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but that apology was a step she needed to take, even if she couldn't repair the damage. Julian, the man who had helped Ethan uncover Sophie's secrets, was also moving on with his life. After years of trying to overcome the wounds Sophie had caused in his previous marriage, he had finally found the courage to open his heart again. In a chance encounter at a work event, he met someone who seemed to understand his scars and accept him for who he was. For the first time in a long time, Julian felt that the past no longer defined him. Meanwhile, Sophie began to reflect deeply on her own life. Unable to continue living in the same apartment she shared with Ethan, she decided to move to a small seaside town where no one knew her. She wanted to start again, away from all the familiar faces that reminded her of her failings. Her art, which for years had been her greatest passion, became her refuge. With intense brushstrokes and dark colors, Sophie began to channel all her pain and regret onto canvas, creating works that surprised even the most skeptical critics. Her first exhibition in the new city was an unexpected success, but at the same time she knew that the void in her heart would never be completely filled. Ethan, on the other hand, began to see a new future alongside Clara. They didn't rush anything, their interactions were built on trust, something he now valued above all else. One evening, as they walked by a lake, Clara held Ethan's hand and asked, "Do you believe you can love again?" Ethan looked at her, thinking carefully before answering. "I think I'm learning. It's not easy, but you've shown me that there's beauty in starting from scratch." Clara smiled, and at that moment, Ethan felt that the weight of the past was finally dissipating. Months later, the lives of everyone involved had taken different turns. Sophie continued to grow as an artist, but her loneliness was a constant reminder of the choices she had made. Julian, now remarried, found peace in letting go of the past. And Ethan, next to Clara, was finally experiencing the feeling of home again, something he never thought possible. Sophie's betrayal had caused a wave of devastation, but it had also forced everyone to confront their own truths. For Ethan, it was the chance to discover that pain didn't have to define who he was. For Sophie, it was a cruel reminder that choices have consequences. And for Julian, it was proof that it is possible to rebuild, even when all seems lost. Did you like the story? Tell us what you thought and share your opinion. We want to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow more stories like this. Here, we always highlight the devastating impact that betrayal can have, making it clear that it is not, and never will be, something we support. See you next time.